WNST, the Orioles could be better. Notes to them. Lord knows they don't listen. They don't have press conferences. They don't have an inbox or a drop box for us to send suggestions. So, in a summer where they're 30 games under 500 and we're floating on toward an all-star game in Washington, D.C., in a Ravens season, we are taking this time to look back, currently, and ahead as the Manny Machados, the Adam Joneses, and yes, Luke, even one of your favorite Orioles, Zach Britton, will be dealt off somewhere if they don't get injured first. We are to the Zach Britton part of the programming here, and I know this is one of your favorite topics to take on. And I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say about it. I have my own thoughts about what all these players say to each other, what their agents say to each other. In the case of Zach Britton, that many folks probably believe he could have, should have, would have been a starting pitcher. Certainly the injury last year and the trade that never happened, that could have happened. Maybe they'll deal him this month. Maybe they won't. They probably should. What his value is. But he stands in the middle of the big, the biggest mistake in modern Oriole history of leaving him on the bench in Toronto. All arguments of everything coming unraveled began with that, right, Luke?
Yeah, that was kind of a seminal moment. Even though they got off to the good start in 2017, 22-10, you really looked at that and the beginning of the end. However you want to to qualify that, it was very clearly a dubious moment. I think one that certainly Zach Britton doesn't wear, because you put that on Buck Showalter and put that on Ubaldo Jimenez and the fact that the Orioles couldn't score enough runs in that wild card game. But that image of Zach Britton in the bullpen kind of just waiting, it really is the final lasting image of what was a good 5-year run for the Orioles. And we've talked about that, and we're kind of eulogizing that while also looking toward what is a very bleak future right now. But I think Zach Britton's really interesting on a number of levels as it relates to this entire discussion with the organization. I think you look at where he was as a failed starter, which, by the way, that is not an uncommon development for any team, let alone the Orioles, to have a failed starting pitcher move into a bullpen role. But I kind of look at Zach Britton as what I would have theorized Jake Arrieta would have been had he stayed in Baltimore. I think if he were to have stayed and if he were to have found success, I think it would have been as a reliever. I think it would have been as a closer. I think what happened with him in Chicago, I don't know if that happens if he goes to the other 28 teams necessarily, but Zach Britton is that guy that Brian Mattis and Jake Arrieta and Chris Tillman early on until he finally found his footing. And you go down the list, Mike Wright, here more recently, of guys that they envisioned being starting pitchers, and it didn't work out. And I think Zach has he's even been at peace over that the last few years. I don't think he has holds any ill will toward the organization. I think he just kind of said, I wasn't good enough. Now, could he have been good enough elsewhere? Could there have been someone that worked with him elsewhere that could have channeled his stuff? He didn't have electric stuff in the same way as Arrieta. He was a guy that, sinker pitcher as a starter. He threw about 91. That's not anything out of the ordinary. That's not something that screams special. But Dave Wallace, certainly when he came in as pitching coach, worked. He and Dom Chidi worked with Zach Britton. They did the string drill on the back mounds in Sarasota, and they got him to really harness that sinker that became such a special pitch. And the rest has been history as far as the second half of his run here in Baltimore. But you have that aspect of it with him being a failed starter. Certainly the wild card game, and everyone talks about that. But then we go to what my big issue has been. He has this historic 2016 season. I mean, what he did as a reliever was the equivalent of hitting 74 home runs.
It was Eckersley-ish, right? I mean, literally.
It was incredible. And for this team to, and look, I understand they were coming off of a wild card season, and I'm not saying you just give them away that off season, but the idea that you wouldn't even entertain the possibility of trading him knowing that he was entering his penultimate year of arbitration and was going to be expensive, and knowing that this team had other needs, specifically at starting pitching at that point, and knowing that their window was rapidly approaching.
But they never think their window's rapidly approaching because Angelos never saw it that way. Well,
sure.
Literally, that was the problem.
I hear you. Peter Angelos might think that, but other people in the organization, even though they didn't proceed that way, you can't tell me that Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette didn't at least look at things that way and at least in the back of their mind say, well, Manny's only 2 years away from free agency at this point, and Jones is the same, and Zach Britton's going to be more expensive in 2017. But I've said this over and over, the idea that they didn't even entertain trade offers 2 off seasons ago, that was organizational malpractice to me. And no one could have necessarily predicted that he would get hurt, but they're pitchers. They break. And no one would have predicted him duplicating his 2016 season the following year, and he certainly didn't, and he got hurt, and then he came back and pitched and was a piece, potential trade piece at the trade deadline. Look, I mean, I've heard various thoughts on the return that they were potentially getting from Houston. I've heard some people say it was good. I've heard some people say it was lousy. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It was probably an okay deal, but
Cleveland was involved too, right? They had teams bidding on him last year.
Yeah, I mean the Dodgers and the Astros, but things proceeded in the way they often do when you're negotiating with the Orioles, and it didn't work out. Now, that's fine. I said at the time, and I'd be hypocritical right now if I tried to use revisionist history here. I said at the time, because he is still at that point a year and a half away from free agency, don't feel compelled that you have to move him right now for any old return if you don't like it, but understand that the clock is ticking. And they weren't aggressive in shopping him this offseason, and then what happens a week before Christmas? Pops his Achilles. Now, they've been very fortunate that he's been able to get back on the field, get back on the mound with enough time to show that he's something close to what he was a couple years ago. And if he's able to do that, they should be able to make a trade and get a decent piece for him. I don't think they're getting anything lucrative for him because I don't think they're getting anything lucrative for Machado. But I think there's a deal to be made there. But the problem with Britton now is, and we've seen this with his first 5 or 6 outings since coming off the DL, he's had his issues with control. His velocity is down a little bit, and I don't think that necessarily screams arm injury, even though he did have the forearm muscular issue last year. But it does speak to, you don't have a lot of time for him to round into form, so what are you going to end up getting for him? Who knows? It may not be very much based on how he's pitched to this point, but he really is such a fascinating case study on their shortcomings in developing pitching, how they were able to salvage him becoming an all-star closer, and they do deserve credit for that much, certainly, but also how special he was in 2016 and how you didn't even really attempt to maximize what would have been at that point. If you had traded him post-wild card game season, man, you talk about some of these Andrew Miller returns, the Aroldis Chapman return that the Yankees got a couple years ago. They would have been getting that and maybe a little bit more for Zach Britton at that point with 2 years of control and coming off arguably the greatest season ever for a relief pitcher. It really feels like what was a huge missed opportunity on that front.
It's like they've wasted him twice. They wasted him in the bullpen, and then they've wasted him on the roster, right? And
yeah, and I mean it's and I'll even take this a step further. From the time that he tore his Achilles, and this was floated out there, so it's not as though this was like a bombshell. But I've heard that there was some willingness on his side. Because remember, he hadn't settled in arbitration at that point when he tore his Achilles. I had heard that there was sentiment on his side, and I've never confirmed this 100% or anything like that, but there was some sentiment that perhaps he'd take a 2-year deal with the thought of get himself back to pitching well, and then the Orioles could keep him and he could rebuild his trade value, and you could give it another shot trading him in the off season, or take him into next year, and if he gets on a roll, then you trade him then. I mean, but the Orioles apparently didn't have any interest in doing that. So would that have been a better situation than what they're in right now, where you're having a guy who's just off the DL and basically still in spring training and trying to kind of find his way and get his groove back? You know, I think you could make an argument that would have been a better route to take, but the Orioles, instead they gave him the final year of arbitration number. He's making $12 million, which that further complicates his trade value because you're not talking about a cheap reliever here. So if he's going to be a little shaky, then he doesn't look nearly as appealing unless you're going to kick in some money. So it really, again, Zach Britton, great contributor, and certainly you can question whether they're winning the division in 2014 if he doesn't settle into the closer role. Remember, Tommy Hunter had really struggled early that season, and Britton came in and was really, really good in that role. And certainly, no way they would have sniffed that second wild card spot if they didn't have Zach Britton pitching the way that he did in 2016. So plenty of positive, but as is the case with many of these individuals we've talked about, you look at the tail end of this run here, and
67 innings, 4 earned runs, dude. Like, I'm looking at it. It's otherworldly, right? Like, I haven't sat and looked at the line. I've looked at the back of a lot of bubblegum cards in my day.
Incredible.
Yeah, when I look at that, I'm like, I did pull Eckersley up, and I pushed it along. I mean, the interesting thing about Eckersley is he never walked anyone, right? I mean,
sure.
that was really his deal. And he also didn't give up home runs. Britton gave up 1 home run, walked 18 guys in 67 innings. 38 hits, 47 saves, an ERA of 0.54.
Incredible. And just to give a little bit of context, and you mentioned that he gave up 4 earned runs that entire season, over 67 innings. The recent series in Atlanta where that Friday night game, he gave up 4 earned runs in that 9th inning. So he gave up 4 earned runs in 1 inning this year, the same number he gave up in all of 2016. And look, relievers are going to blow up from time to time. I mean, that's not nearly as much an indictment on what happened in Atlanta as it is just, it reminds you how incredible he was in 2016. And again, by extension, it reminds you of how lucrative his trade value would have been had the Orioles at least entertained the possibility of trading him that offseason. And they didn't, and you look where they are now, and now you're hoping you can salvage something decent for what has been a really, really special asset for them, even if he's not going to come close to reaching that level he did a couple years ago.
Zach Britton, amongst other conversations, you can read, hear all about it out in the bio, Toyota.com Audio Vault. The hashtag is simply Dear Orioles. So make sure you're using that. You can write your own letters. I am inking my personal letters since I don't have a press credential. They don't sit with me. They're not calling me in to say, hey, how do you feel about the Orioles after all of these years and 20 years of WNST this summer and all that? There's going to be massive transition. Luke and I are monitoring all parts of that. In the case of Britton and tying him to Arrieta and tying him to Mattis and what that era, and Tillman as well, and what that era represents, this is sort of this will be the end of that too, right? Whenever Zach Britton is dealt off to the Cubs for a bag of baseballs or whatever it's going to be later on this month, and they'll deal him, right? I mean, I don't know that they'll ever get enough for Machado, but Britton will be gone. He's not here in August, right?
I would think so, but again, he has to start pitching better. And as much as, you know me, I'm the king of small sample and not wanting to overreact and letting a season breathe and all those different things we talk about in April and May. Well, this is basically April and May for him. This is April for him.
Yeah, I would agree with you. A slump wouldn't hurt Machado's trade value between now and the All-Star break. Britton, every time he touches the ball, right, it's a full-on, you're trying out for my 94-win team. Do I want you in my bullpen? Period.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough in that regard. Now, it helps that he's left-handed. It helps that he has the track record that he does. Don't get me wrong. I think some teams would, even if he's struggling, would take him on, but again, he's not cheap. And if you're the Orioles, you don't want it to strictly be a salary dump. You'd like to get something, even if it's just a flyer, even if it's just a low-level minor leaguer. I mean, you'd like to get something, but he's He's got to pitch well.
Boy, the salary part of it really is a drag. Like, I took a look down. You pick him up, you're going to pay him $4 million to do whatever you're going to do.
That's not completely restrictive, but it's certainly an obstacle that teams are going to have to think about. It's certainly something that a team might say, well, if we got to pay the entire $4 million, we're only giving you prospect
nothing.
Whatever.
I don't think they would give you anything if they got to pay him $4 million
they'll give you something, but my point is it's just something. It's someone that is a maybe, not someone that you look to and say, oh, that guy'd be the 10th best prospect in our system right now. You're not going to get something like that unless he really gets on a roll over the next few weeks. So you hope for that. If he doesn't get on a roll, I don't know. I don't know what that means. I don't know if perhaps, and this goes back to having a lame duck front office right now, under normal circumstances, if you had a general manager that was a long-term guy that was going to be here for the duration, maybe if he were struggling, maybe you'd go to him and say, you know what, Zach, let's sign a one-year deal for next year. And you can build up your value a little bit. It'll be a pillow contract for you. And we'll call it, let's not BS you or anything. We're going to be looking to deal you at some point by next year's trade deadline. I could absolutely see a scenario where that could be something that could work for both sides if you had a GM that was going to be here beyond the next couple months. So do I think something like that will happen? No. Do I think that's something that could conceivably could have been on the table if you had more stability? Yeah. That's something you probably could talk about, but if you're not doing that, then you got to move them. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. In the case of Machado, I've said over and over, and I even feel that way with Adam Jones. We'll talk about him in a different conversation, but I think there are good deals to be made for those individuals. Zach Britton's got to pitch better, and he needs to show that he's right physically, not just with the Achilles, which by all accounts it seemed okay, more so with getting his arm back to a place where he was a couple years ago. And he's never going to be 2016 Britton again, but I think he can certainly be better than he's been over his first 5 or 6 outings since coming back from the DL. But that's a little more of a question, and you're relying a little more on a small sample size there. And so that's true for both the Orioles and potential suitors. So I am interested to see what kind of market is going to develop for him over the next few weeks, certainly.
Yeah, all right, man. Well, we're going to go through all these players. If you want to listen to these conversations, they're out in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault. I know Luke's going to be writing about this throughout the course of July, and I am writing a letter to Zach Britton that I will read on the air in a couple of weeks, and you'll have that up on the website as well. All of our Orioles coverage out there, Luke will be at the ballpark when they're home. I'll be watching. We'll be tweeting and opining, but, of course, when there is breaking news and any of these deals happen, you'll get it first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And of course, Dennis will be here this Thursday, next Thursday, every Thursday from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Got to tell you about our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club as well. We send our morning newspaper out at 7 a.m. each and every morning. The entries for Laurel this weekend are in the morning newspaper as well as on the front of WNST.net. It's all brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club, the new sports bar, open, air-conditioned, and very lovely down at Laurel. I love the crab cakes down there as well. Get on down to Laurel and bet on the ponies and say hello down there. Laurel Park and the Maryland Jockey Club out on the front of WNST.net as well. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. You can find Luke, Baltimore Luke, on Twitter, as well as Luke at WNST.net. We're both out on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNS TV channel. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 at WNST Tassel, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.